Welcome back to County Connection. For this next segment, we're going to talk about having conversations with your kids about alcohol, marijuana, and other substances. And here to enlighten us is Kellen Glynn, the coordinator for Healthy Futures Initiative. Welcome, Kellen.
Hi, Julie. Thank you.
So, Kellen, let's start off by talking about why it's so important to have these kinds of conversations with our kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to have these conversations because it's a part of our culture, especially here in Summit County. This is a resort town, and we see it a lot. We have a lot of events that incorporate alcohol. So it's really important for parents to get in front of it and just be a resource to their kids about what to do if you're faced with a tough decision and how to handle it.
So these conversations can feel kind of tricky for a lot of parents, and not just parents, but also any of us who are in a kind of mentor type of a role, whether it's a coach or a teacher or anyone who interacts with kids in significant ways. And so, what ages should we think about for when it's appropriate to start having these types of conversations?
Well, and really my perspective is that it's never too early to start talking to your kids about these things. The conversations around resiliency and how to stand up for yourself and having confidence as a kid, those conversations should start as early as kids are able to have conversations. That should sort of be put in place as a foundational aspect of kids' development. So really, it's never too early. Specific conversations around marijuana, drugs, alcohol, those kinds of things, probably around 8 or 9 is the recommended age. And I know that sounds a little early, and some parents might feel like that's too soon, but you're really not doing any harm by having the conversation and getting out in front of it, talking to the kids, opening up the door of communication. If other kids are talking about it with their parents, hopefully they're talking about it with each other, and then they can be a source of information instead of just having it be consequence-based when you're an older teen.
Sure, like not waiting until something tough happens.
Right, exactly. You don't want to wait until the conversation has to happen. You want to get in front of it first, and then it can be an open conversation. It can be respectful and information and resource-based, so that kids start to see their parents as a place that they can go to talk to about questions they have.
And so when we talk about starting conversations with kids on these topics at the ages of, say, 8 or 9, it's not the same type of conversation that you would have with a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how these conversations progress through a child's development?
Sure, yeah. The earlier conversations, like I said, are more about information and resources, and what do you do if you're in a hard spot with a friend or in a situation that you don't feel comfortable in. So kind of opening the door to broader subjects about discomfort and confidence. Those kinds of things are there when the child is younger. Just sort of asking what they might know about it, asking questions around if they've ever heard of it, if they've ever seen it. That's for like the younger conversation, and just having it be really broad and open, open-ended, so that they feel like they can ask questions that they have. If kids at that age have heard of it or have seen it or just have experienced it in some informal way, they then feel like they can talk about it, and it can be a conversation that they're not going to get in trouble with.
Yeah. And then how about as kids get older and they do start to kind of get into middle school and high school?
Well, and the biggest thing for parents to keep in mind, or as you said, trusted adults, mentors, coaches, things like that, is to have it really be an open conversation. So a lot of times parents and teens at this age can be really combative, because one of the main functions for a kid at this age is to really rebel and find their independence and break away from the parent. And so the friendships are more important than parent relationships, and this can be a really combative time for parents and kids. And the first thing to kind of keep in mind is that you don't want these conversations to be combative. You want them to be open and respectful and around trust and encouraging positive choices. So you really want, as a parent, to approach your kid at that age very respectfully and open. Non-judgmental is huge. Kids often feel like their parents are just there to enforce rules, and parents often feel like their only job is to be the police of the house, and it can be this really tough role for both parent and kid. So really trying to come to the conversation openly and ask questions about what they see and what they would do and how they would handle a tough situation, and trying really hard not to keep it just on a consequence based, or just saying, you know, you would be in trouble if you did this, or these kinds of actions would get your phone taken away, or get, you know, certain punishments, so to speak. And kids often feel like they can't really talk to parents because they're afraid of those consequences. So it's really important to kind of make sure that it's an open, trusting relationship, and that parents are modeling good behaviors too, and not just in their own use at home, but also in the conversation and the way that they embrace trust and respect with their kids.
Yeah. So let's talk about some specific examples, because sometimes it just can feel like it's a struggle to kind of come up with the right words, and you're, you know, worried about sabotaging this whole subject. So like, as an example, you said, oh, if you do X, then you're going to lose your phone. So what would be a different way to, a different angle to approach that gets you to open up the conversation more?
Right. So, and I think even before the conversation happens, something that's really important is to make sure that parents feel like they're in a good space to be able to have that conversation. And this comes into play a lot of times after an event has happened, or a mistake has occurred, or there has been some sort of trouble. We really, as a parent, want to make sure that you take a step back and make sure you're in a sound place to have an open conversation, because sometimes it can be really hard as a parent to not go right to the end result of the consequence. So you want to make sure that you've given yourself the time that you need to step back and say, how can I address this? But then, some examples would just be before, if you can have the conversation before an event happens or an occurrence happens, to say things like, you know, if you're at a party or you're with friends and somebody brings up alcohol or is starting to use something, what would you do? And what would your reaction be? And you might ask if they have somebody that they feel like they can call to get out of that situation. You just want to kind of introduce these questions to bring up strategies for the kids to think about, so that if they do find themselves in a predicament, which they probably will, to
That's the reality.
Yeah, exactly. To have some sort of resources and some tools that they don't have to think on the spot. Because peer pressure can be tough, and if you have to think of a solution, you might not be as quick-witted as you would if you had something to go back on. Yeah.
So to your point about not waiting till the kind of a negative situation happens, what are some examples of openings that a parent might kind of take advantage of to bring up these topics?
Yeah, sure. So, and as we talked about in Summit County, it is kind of around us a little bit more than maybe in some other areas of the country. And so utilizing the events that we have, so using the space that we have, if you're at an event with your kid and there is somebody drinking or smoking and you smell it, you might use that as a topic conversation starter and say, oh, do you smell that? Like, what do you think of that? And do your friends, or, you know, is that ever an issue for you? Do you have to think about that at all? And what kinds of things would happen if you did use or get caught drinking? Like, what kinds of things would happen to you in your life? And sort of placing that question out there. There's a lot of things that happen on TV where there's lots of examples of people drinking or using marijuana, and just using those little tidbits of information as a way to sort of introduce a conversation especially at like an older teen level or that middle teenage time. I think a lot of times parents get them into they work themselves up into thinking they have to have a talk with their kids, and it always has to be like a big sit down conversation, and it just doesn't have to be that way. Actually, probably more productive is to just throw it out there if you see something or smell something, or if it comes up, if there's an event where a family member, a friend is drinking or is overserved, so to speak. It might be a useful time to just say like, hey, what do you think of that? And have that be the conversation starter where you just introduce the topic a little bit. I think kids, especially in that teenage year, are more receptive to one-off conversations than they are to, oh, I have to sit down and have this big talk with my mom or with dad or whoever it might be. So less intimidating for both parties.
Right. And it seems like it just kind of feels a lot more comfortable to kind of break it down into more bite-sized chunks rather than to have that big talk.
Yeah,
I feel like
absolutely.
I remember that big talk from my own teenagers.
And it's awkward. You just remember it as being awkward. You don't really remember the details of how it went. You're just like, oh, how do I get out of this immediately? So I think that's the biggest thing is use those little moments as ways to sort of break the ice, let them know that the conversation is available and that it's allowed, and they're not going to get in trouble for talking about marijuana or alcohol, that they're not going to get punished just because they bring it up. One of the biggest things that I notice and hear from that age group, the young people, is that they feel like if they even bring it up sometimes, then the parent's going to automatically assume that they're doing it. And I think that that's a tough spot, because I think parents do get sort of that like heightened awareness around it, and not that they shouldn't, but just to really try to settle yourself back down and say, well, what are your questions and what are you interested to learn about? And maybe I don't have the answers, maybe we can research it together and find out, and make it more of a conversation than it needs to be like accusatory or nerve-wracking. So.
Right. Okay, great. So there are a lot of great resources out there for parents who want to kind of dig in a little more deeply and get some more tips. So what are your favorites?
The Good to Know campaign, which is what we use here in Summit County. We promote a lot of it, so it's in the Summit Daily often. But it's called Good to Know, and it's a state campaign around marijuana awareness and it has a lot of these topics: how to talk to your kids, what the facts are around marijuana legalization and everything around that. So the website is goodtoknowcolorado.com. And then there's also Speak Now, which is also another kind of arm of the Good to Know campaign, which really specifies how exactly to bring up these conversations with kids of different age groups. And so it's a lot of parent tips and resources and videos and scripts even to kind of familiarize yourself.
And how about if people are looking for some local resources here in the community?
They can reach the Healthy Futures Initiative page at summitcountyco.gov.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thanks so much. These are some great tips, Kellen, and thanks for sharing them with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how to conserve water here in Summit County.